Under the flickering torchlight, Pharaoh Ramses gazes in awe at the young woman found on the banks of the Nile. No one knows where she came from or how she survived, and she herself remembers nothing of her past. Yet something in the palace feels eerily familiar, as if it belongs to a world her mind has forgotten. Bound by duty to an arranged marriage, Ramses cannot ignore the connection he feels with her. As the mysteries of her origins unravel, ancient secrets resurface, hidden dangers threaten the stability of the kingdom, and powerful forces conspire to keep them apart. In a game of intrigue and intertwined fates, they must defy the will of the gods to forge their own destiny. The Nile's waters churned violently under the assault of the storm, its usually calm surface transformed into a roiling tempest that mirrored the tumultuous sky above. Pharaoh Ramses stood at the bow of the royal barge, his tall figure silhouetted against the dark clouds that gathered ominously on the horizon. The wind whipped his royal garments around his muscular frame, but he remained steady, his eyes narrowed against the stinging rain as he surveyed the angry river. "My lord, we must seek shelter," the captain's voice barely carried over the howling wind. "The gods themselves warn against traveling further." Ramses raised a hand, silencing the man with a gesture. There was something in the water ahead, something that didn't belong among the churning waves and debris swept along by the current. "Bring us closer to the eastern shore," he commanded, his deep voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The crew scrambled to obey, fighting against the current that threatened to dash their vessel against the jagged rocks that lined portions of the riverbank. Ramses gripped the wooden railing, his knuckles whitening as he strained to make out what had caught his eye. "There," he shouted, pointing toward a pale shape being tossed by the waves near the shore. A person. Without hesitation, Ramses dove into the raging waters. The cold shock of it stole his breath momentarily, but years of swimming in the Nile had made him strong. He cut through the current with powerful strokes, his eyes fixed on the pale form that appeared and disappeared beneath the surface. "My pharaoh!" The panicked cries of his guards faded behind him as he reached the unconscious figure, a young woman, her soaked linen garment clinging to her slender frame. Her face, partially obscured by long dark hair, bore no marks of injury, yet she remained unresponsive as Ramses hooked an arm around her waist and began the difficult journey back to shore. By the time his feet found purchase on the muddy riverbank, his guards had managed to bring the barge closer. They rushed to assist him, their faces masks of concern and awe at their ruler's daring rescue. "Quickly, bring blankets," Ramses commanded as he gently laid the woman on dry ground. In the flashes of lightning that illuminated the scene, he studied her face. She was beautiful, with delicate features that hinted at noble blood, but there was something else, something he couldn't quite place, that made him certain she was no ordinary Egyptian. One of his personal physicians rushed forward, kneeling beside the mysterious woman. "She lives, my lord," he announced after examining her, "but her pulse is weak." Ramses nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "Who are you?" he murmured, though he expected no answer from her still form. "And how did you come to be at the mercy of the Nile?" The woman's eyelids fluttered briefly, but she did not wake. In the momentary glimpse of her eyes, Ramses was struck by their unusual color, a green as deep as the finest jade from distant lands. Such eyes were rare in Egypt, marking her further as someone extraordinary. "My lord, we found this clutched in her hand," one of the guards said, extending his palm to reveal a small amulet, a scarab beetle carved from lapis lazuli, hanging from a broken golden chain. Ramses took it, examining the intricate hieroglyphs etched into its surface. They were ancient symbols, some he recognized and others that puzzled even his educated mind. "She wears no other jewelry, no identifying marks of family or position," the physician observed. "Her garments, though of fine linen, bear no insignia." "A mystery, then," Ramses mused, closing his fist around the amulet. The storm was beginning to abate, as though its sole purpose had been to deliver this strange woman to him. "Prepare a litter. We take her to Thebes." "To the House of Life, my lord?" the physician inquired, referring to the temple complex where the sick and injured were treated. "No," Ramses decided, his tone brooking no argument. "To the palace." The guards exchanged glances, but knew better than to question their pharaoh's decision. As they carefully transferred the unconscious woman to a hastily prepared litter, Ramses could not shake the feeling that the gods had orchestrated this encounter, that this woman's arrival during the storm was no mere coincidence, but a sign from the divine. In the distance, Thebes awaited, its grand temples and palaces standing as testaments to Egypt's glory. Within those walls, secrets were kept and destinies shaped, and now Ramses thought as he watched his men secure the mysterious woman for transport, another story would unfold, one that perhaps the gods themselves had written in the stars. The journey back to Thebes was mercifully quick, the storm having spent its fury. Throughout the trip, Ramses found himself returning to the woman's side, searching her peaceful face for clues to her identity. Who was she? A foreign princess? A priestess? A common woman with uncommon beauty? The questions multiplied with each passing hour, building a tension within him that he could not explain. "She stirs, my lord," one of the attendants reported as they approached the outskirts of the great city. Ramses moved quickly to the litter, arriving just as the woman's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded her features as she took in her surroundings. The swaying litter, the armed guards, the imposing figure of the pharaoh himself. "You're safe," Ramses said, his voice gentler than any in his entourage had heard in some time. "You were in the river. Do you remember how you came to be there?" The woman's brow furrowed, and when she spoke, her voice was hoarse, as though unused for some time. I don't..." Her hand went to her throat, panic flickering across her features. "Your name," Ramses prompted, leaning closer. She shook her head slowly, tears welling in those remarkable eyes. "I don't know," she whispered, the admission clearly causing her distress. "I don't remember anything." The physician who had been observing stepped forward. "Sometimes, my lord, when one has suffered a trauma, the memory hides itself away. It may return in time." Ramses nodded thoughtfully, his gaze never leaving the woman's face. "Then we shall wait," he declared. "Until then, you are under my protection." Relief and gratitude softened her features, though confusion still lingered in her eyes. "Thank you," she murmured, then hesitated. May I ask who you are?" A rare smile crossed Ramses's face, an expression noted with surprise by those who served him. "I am Ramses, pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt, living Horus, son of Ra." The woman's eyes widened, and she attempted to bow her head in deference despite her prone position. "My lord," she began, but Ramses shook his head. "Rest now," he commanded, though not unkindly. "We approach Thebes, and decisions must be made." As the woman drifted back into a more peaceful sleep, Ramses stood at the edge of the litter, his mind racing with possibilities. The royal court was a nest of vipers, each noble and priest with their own agenda. A mysterious woman with no memory or apparent identity would be fodder for gossip and intrigue, perhaps even danger. No, he decided as the great gates of Thebes appeared before them. This woman and the mystery she represented would remain his secret for now. In the shadows of the palace, away from prying eyes and wagging tongues, perhaps the truth would emerge, and until it did, he would keep her close. This gift the Nile had bestowed upon him during the storm. The royal procession passed through the city gates, the people bowing low as their god-king returned. Little did they know that secluded within their pharaoh's entourage lay a mystery that would soon shake the very foundations of the two lands, changing the course of Egypt's destiny forever. The alabaster walls of the palace in Thebes gleamed like polished bone in the early morning light, stretching toward the heavens as though reaching for the realm of the gods themselves. Within these sacred walls, Pharaoh Ramses moved with purpose, his sandaled feet making little sound on the cool stone floors as he navigated the labyrinthine corridors that few besides himself knew intimately. "My lord," Nebamun, his most trusted steward, hurried to match the pharaoh's long strides. "The eastern chambers have been prepared as you commanded, but if I may be so bold," he hesitated, years of service giving him the rare courage to question his divine ruler. Ramses slowed, casting an appraising glance at the older man. "Speak freely, old friend. The woman you rescued, bringing her into the heart of the palace without announcement or explanation. Tongues are already wagging below stairs." Nebamun lowered his voice. "The high priest of Amun has requested an audience this very morning. I suspect he has caught wind of your unusual guest." A muscle tightened in Ramses' jaw. "Deny him. Say I am in prayer and meditation." "As you wish, my lord." Nebamun bowed his head. "And what of the royal council? They expect your presence to discuss the Memphite delegation's arrival next week." "The council can wait," Ramses replied, his tone brooking no argument. "Our guest's condition is more pressing." They turned down a corridor adorned with vibrant paintings depicting scenes from the Book of the Dead, souls being weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the journey through the underworld, the gods in all their splendor. Few servants ventured here. These passageways led to chambers reserved for the royal family's most private affairs. "Has she spoken?" Ramses asked, his pace quickening again. "Only to request water, my lord. The physician Penhasi attends her. He reports that her physical condition improves, but her memory remains elusive." Ramses nodded thoughtfully. "And the amulet found with her? The scribes study it even now, though they say some of the hieroglyphs are unlike any they have seen before." Nebamun's wrinkled face creased further with concern. "My lord, if I may, there are whispers that she may be foreign, perhaps even a spy from the Hittites or—" "Enough," Ramses raised a hand. "I will judge her myself." They arrived at an ornately carved cedar door, flanked by two of Ramses' personal guard. Men chosen not only for their fighting prowess, but for their discretion. They stood at attention as the pharaoh approached. "Leave us," Ramses commanded, and both the guards and Nebamun bowed deeply before retreating down the corridor. Alone before the door, Ramses paused. Since pulling the mysterious woman from the Nile, he had been plagued by strange dreams, visions of a golden bark sailing across star-filled skies, of a woman whose face shifted between that of his mysterious guest and the goddess Isis herself. Were the gods sending him a message, or was his fascination with the woman clouding his judgment? Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The chamber was spacious, yet intimate, with high windows that admitted the morning light while preserving privacy. The walls were adorned with scenes of the Nile in all its bounty, fish leaping from azure waters, birds soaring through reed thickets, and bountiful harvests along fertile shores. A gentle breeze carried the scent of lotus blossoms from the garden beyond, and there, seated on a cushioned bench near the window, was the woman from the river. Sunlight illuminated her profile, casting her in a golden glow that seemed almost divine. Her dark hair had been washed and dressed with fragrant oils, and she wore a simple linen gown provided by the palace servants. She turned as Ramses entered, those remarkable green eyes widening in recognition. "My lord Pharaoh." She attempted to rise, but Ramses gestured for her to remain seated. "You remember me then?" he said, approaching slowly. A small smile touched her lips. "How could I forget the man who pulled me from the river? They tell me you risked your own safety to save me." "A stranger." "The Nile is sacred to all Egyptians," Ramses replied, taking a seat across from her. "What the river gives, we do not refuse." He studied her face, the high cheekbones, the refined features that spoke of noble breeding. "How do you feel today?" "My body heals," she said, touching her temple lightly. "But my mind—" her voice faltered. "It's like trying to grasp at smoke. I catch glimpses, a flicker of a face, the echo of a voice, but nothing solid, nothing whole." "The physician believes your memories may return in time," Ramses offered. "And if they don't?" There was a quiet dignity in her question, a strength that impressed him. Ramses considered her for a long moment. "Then we shall give you new ones." The woman's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "You are kind, my lord, to a woman who cannot even offer her name in gratitude." "We must call you something," Ramses mused, "until your true name returns to you." He thought of the amulet found clutched in her hand, a symbol of protection and rebirth. "Aset," he decided, her brow furrowed. "Aset, after the goddess Isis. Aset in our ancient tongue. She who pieced together what was broken, who restored what was lost." Ramses watched her reaction carefully. "Does it please you?" The woman closed her eyes as though testing the name in the silence of her mind. When she opened them again, there was a new light there, a spark of identity reclaimed, if only in part. "Aset," she repeated, and her voice seemed to gain strength with the utterance. "Yes, I think it suits me well, my lord." Ramses nodded, satisfied. "Then Aset you shall be, until the gods see fit to restore your true name." A brief silence fell between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken questions. Finally, Aset spoke. "The servant who brought me breakfast mentioned that I am to remain in these chambers, that I should not wander the palace." Her gaze was direct, unflinching. "Am I a prisoner, my lord?" The question was bold, perhaps too bold for one addressing the living Horus, but Ramses found himself appreciating her frankness rather than taking offense. "Not a prisoner," he assured her. "A protected guest. The royal court is a place of intrigue and ambition, Aset. Without knowing your identity or your purpose here, I cannot guarantee your safety among those who might see you as a threat, or an opportunity to curry favor by uncovering your secrets before I do." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You're protecting me from your own court?" "For now," Ramses confirmed, "until we know more." Aset nodded slowly. "You risk much to shelter a woman who may be nobody at all, or somebody of great significance," Ramses countered. "The gods do not deliver ordinary souls to Pharaoh's feet during a storm." He rose from his seat, moving to the window to gaze out at the sprawling city beyond. "I have assigned handmaidens to attend you, women from my personal household whom I trust. They will provide whatever you need and report directly to me." "Thank you, my lord." Ramses turned back to her, struck again by her composed demeanor. Most would be overwrought in her situation, lost, memoryless, dependent on the mercy of a king. Yet she maintained an almost regal dignity that reinforced his suspicion that she was no common Egyptian. "Rest today," he instructed. "Tomorrow, if your strength permits, I will have the royal physician test your knowledge. Perhaps what you recall of writing, of languages, of customs, may provide clues to your origins." "As you wish, my lord." She hesitated, then added, "May I ask the amulet I had with me? It is being studied by my scribes," Ramses explained. "It bears unusual markings. A flash of something, recognition perhaps, crossed her features. May I see it? Perhaps it might spark a memory." Ramses considered the request. The amulet was the only tangible connection to her past, and denying her access to it seemed needlessly cruel. "I will have it brought to you," he decided, "though I ask that you share with me anything it might reveal." Relief softened her features. "Of course, my lord, I am in your debt." A knock at the door interrupted them, and Nebamun's voice called from outside. "My pharaoh, forgive the intrusion, but the matter cannot wait." Ramses sighed, the concerns of rule intruding once more. "I must go," he told Aset, "but I will return when I can." He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at her. "Is there anything else you require?" Aset shook her head, but then reconsidered. "Perhaps something to read, if it wouldn't be too much trouble. I feel that books were important to me." The request surprised him. Literacy was not common, even among noblewomen. "I will have scrolls brought to you," he promised, even more intrigued by this mysterious woman who desired knowledge above all other comforts. As he left the chamber, instructing the guards to resume their posts, Ramses found his thoughts lingering on Aset's green eyes, on the quiet strength she exhibited, on the mystery that surrounded her like a veil. In a life dictated by ritual and tradition, where his every move was predetermined by the expectations of his station, she represented something unexpected, a riddle the gods had placed in his path. And as Pharaoh moved through his palace to attend to the duties of rule, he found himself for the first time in years, eager for the day's obligations to end, so that he might return to unravel the mystery that was Aset. Little did he know that beyond the palace walls, forces were already aligning against this unexpected disruption to the carefully balanced politics of the Egyptian court. In Memphis, a princess prepared for her journey to Thebes, unaware that her carefully negotiated future as Pharaoh's bride faced an unforeseen complication, and in the shadows of the great temples, priests whispered of omens and portents, of a stranger whose arrival might either save Egypt or bring about its downfall. The great hall of audience sparkled with unprecedented splendor. Alabaster columns soared toward a ceiling painted with stars that mirrored the night sky, while gold leaf adorned every surface that could possibly accommodate it. Ramses sat upon the golden throne of Egypt, the double crown resting heavily upon his brow as he surveyed the assembled court before him. His face remained an impassive mask, betraying none of the turmoil that raged within. "The Princess Nefret of Memphis approaches, Divine One," announced the royal herald, his voice echoing through the cavernous hall. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd as the great cedar doors swung open. The delegation from Memphis entered with calculated pageantry, musicians first, playing silver flutes and sistrum rattles, followed by attendants scattering lotus petals and burning incense. Then came the gift-bearers, each carrying treasures of such magnificence that even the jaded courtiers of Thebes could not suppress their murmurs of appreciation. And finally, walking with measured steps beneath a canopy of ostrich feathers, came Princess Nefret herself. Ramses straightened almost imperceptibly. He had, of course, seen likenesses of the princess before, painted portraits sent ahead to assure him of her beauty. But art, he now realized, had failed to capture the essence of the woman who approached his throne. Princess Nefret was indeed beautiful, with smooth copper skin and almond-shaped eyes lined with kohl that extended dramatically toward her temples. Her lips, painted a deep red, curved in a practiced smile that never quite reached those calculating eyes. She moved with the liquid grace of a woman well versed in the power of her own allure, her beaded gown whispering secrets with each swaying step. "Great house, living Horus, mighty bull of the two lands," she intoned, her voice melodic and carefully modulated as she prostrated herself before the throne. "I, Nefret, daughter of the governor of Memphis, come bearing the love and loyalty of the North." Ramses descended the steps of his dais, extending his hand as custom dictated to raise her from her prostration. "Memphis honors Thebes with its most precious jewel," he replied, the formal words feeling like sand in his mouth. "Rise, princess, and be welcome in the house of Pharaoh." As Nefret rose, her eyes met his with a boldness that few would dare. In that gaze, Ramses saw intelligence, ambition, and something else, a hunger that went beyond the normal desire for power. This was a woman who had been raised from birth to become a queen, and she would not be denied her destiny. "The journey was long, but the destination makes every hardship worthwhile, Divine One," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for those nearest the throne to hear. "I have dreamed of this moment since I was a child." "No doubt you have," Ramses thought, maintaining his diplomatic smile. The marriage contract between himself and Nefret had been negotiated when she was barely 10 years old, a political alliance meant to strengthen ties between Thebes and Memphis and to secure the loyalty of the increasingly independent northern provinces. For 14 years, the princess had been groomed for this role, educated in the arts of courtly behavior, statecraft, and the duties of a great royal wife. And now, at last, she had arrived to claim her prize. "Her feast has been prepared in your honor," Ramses announced to the assembly. "Let all of Thebes celebrate the arrival of the Princess Nefret." Cheers erupted from the court as musicians struck up a triumphant tune. The formal ceremony complete, courtiers moved forward to pay their respects to the princess, each hoping to establish themselves in the good graces of the future queen. Ramses used the moment to retreat slightly, nodding to Nebamun, who appeared instantly at his side. "How is our other guest?" he asked in a low voice, his eyes never leaving the spectacle before him. The old steward understood immediately. "The woman continues to improve, my pharaoh. She spends her days reading the scrolls you provided. The physician reports that while her memory remains clouded, her knowledge of hieroglyphs is remarkable." "And has she remembered anything new?" "Nothing substantial, my lord, though she did identify several of the unusual symbols on her amulet. She claims they represent constellations not commonly recorded in our star charts." Ramses absorbed this information. His interest piqued. Astronomy was a sacred science in Egypt, intimately connected with the timing of festivals, agricultural cycles, and the very understanding of the divine order. Someone with unusual astronomical knowledge could be a priestess, a foreign scholar, or... His thoughts were interrupted as Vizier Passer approached, bowing low. "Divine One, the priests of Amun request a moment of your time in private." The vizier's eyes slid meaningfully toward Princess Nefret, who was holding court across the hall. "Now?" Ramses frowned. "In the midst of the welcome feast? They insist it concerns matters of divine timing, my pharaoh." Pacer's careful phrasing told Ramses all he needed to know. This was about the marriage, about setting the date. With a barely suppressed sigh, Ramses nodded. "Very well." The small audience chamber. As he followed Passer from the hall, Ramses found his thoughts drifting not to the princess he was duty-bound to marry, but to the mysterious woman hidden within his palace. For 2 weeks now, Aset had been his secret guest, and in that time their conversations had become the brightest moments of his days. Unlike the sycophants of his court, she spoke to him with refreshing honesty, challenging his ideas and sharing insights that often surprised him with their wisdom. Last evening, they had discussed the nature of justice until the lamps burned low, with Aset arguing passionately for the rights of common people in a way that both startled and impressed him. There was a natural nobility in her bearing that required no royal blood to authenticate it, a quality that made him increasingly certain she was no ordinary woman. But who was she? The question haunted him still. Ramses entered the small audience chamber to find 3 priests of Amun waiting, their shaved heads gleaming in the lamplight, their leopard skin cloaks marking them as the highest of the temple hierarchy. "Divine One," the eldest began, bowing low, "we have consulted the stars and the sacred texts. The most auspicious date for your union with Princess Nefret falls precisely 1 month from today, during the festival of Opet, when the god Amun journeys from his temple to commune with his earthly manifestation, yourself. Ramses felt something cold settle in his stomach. 1 month, so soon. The timing is perfect, continued another priest, his voice practically vibrating with satisfaction. The princess will have time to settle into the palace. The preparations can be completed without undue haste, and the marriage will coincide with the most sacred festival of the year, ensuring the god's highest blessings. And, added the third, the governor of Memphis has sent word that he considers this timing most appropriate, given the recent unrest in the northern provinces. A royal marriage would do much to cement loyalties that have begun to waver. And there it was, the political reality behind the divine window dressing. Memphis was restless, its ambitious governor perhaps testing the limits of Pharaoh's patience. This marriage was no longer merely advantageous, it was becoming necessary to prevent potential rebellion. The god's will is clear, Ramses acknowledged, though inwardly he felt a resistance that surprised him with its intensity. Make the necessary preparations. The priests bowed deeply, clearly pleased. There is one more matter, Divine One, the eldest said, hesitating slightly. There are rumors among the serving staff, whispers of a foreign woman kept in the royal family's private quarters. Ramses stiffened, his expression darkening. You overstep, priest. Forgive me, living Horus, the priest hurried to add, prostrating himself. We speak only out of concern for divine protocol. The princess and her retinue will require accommodations in the royal family's wing. If there is indeed a guest of unusual status, perhaps arrangements should be made to relocate her before the princess's household takes residence. Fury rose in Ramses's chest, though his face remained impassive. These priests, for all their bowing and scraping, were overreaching their authority, reminding him of the political delicacy of his position while simultaneously attempting to dictate arrangements within his own household. My private affairs are not the concern of the temple, he stated coldly. Remember your place. The priests bowed lower, recognizing they had pushed too far. 1,000 pardons, Divine One. We speak only in service to Ma'at, to the proper order of things. Then serve that order by preparing the temple for the festival, not by trafficking in palace gossip. Ramses turned to leave, then paused. The date is acceptable. 1 month hence during Opet, I will take Princess Nefret as my great royal wife. That is all you need concern yourselves with. As he strode from the chamber, Ramses' mind raced. 1 month. In 30 days, he would be bound to Nefret, a woman whose ambition was as evident as the coal that lined her eyes. It was a necessary union, one that would strengthen Egypt and secure his northern borders. He had known this day would come since he first ascended the throne. So why did the prospect now fill him with such reluctance? He knew the answer, though he hesitated to acknowledge it even to himself. In the short time since pulling Aset from the river, she had become more than a curiosity or a mystery to be solved. Their conversations, her insights, the strange connection he felt when in her presence, all of it had awakened something within him that he had thought long buried beneath the weight of royal duty. As if conjured by his thoughts, he rounded a corner and nearly collided with Nebamun, who was hurrying in the opposite direction. My pharaoh, the old steward looked uncharacteristically flustered. I was coming to find you. It's the woman, Aset. Alarm shot through Ramses. What has happened? Is she ill? No, my lord, but she asked to see the night sky. She said it might help her remember. I took the liberty of arranging a brief visit to the small garden courtyard, with guards ensuring privacy, of course, but she, Nebamun hesitated. Speak plainly, Ramses commanded. She began to weep, my lord, when she saw the stars, and then she said the strangest thing. She said, I know this sky. I have plotted these stars before. And then she asked for papyrus and ink, and she began to draw star charts, complex ones with calculations in the margins that even the royal astronomers might struggle to comprehend. Ramses' pulse quickened. Where is she now? I returned her to her chambers, my lord. She's still drawing, star after star, constellation after constellation. It's as though a dam has broken in her mind. Without another word, Ramses changed direction, heading toward the private wing where Aset was housed. The feast, the princess, the priests, all would have to wait. This development might finally provide the key to unlocking Aset's identity. As he hurried through the corridors, Ramses tried to ignore the small voice in his mind that whispered an uncomfortable truth. His eagerness to uncover Aset's past had nothing to do with political security or divine omens. It was personal. dangerously so. For a pharaoh bound by duty and tradition, whose every action was prescribed by millennia of precedent, such personal feelings were a luxury he could ill afford, especially now, with Princess Nefret installed in his palace and a wedding date looming on the horizon. Yet still his feet carried him swiftly toward Aset's chambers, drawn by a force that felt as inevitable as the Nile's annual flood. And in his heart a conflict was brewing, one that threatened to shake the very foundations of his reign. For how could Egypt's divine ruler, the living embodiment of Horus on earth, possibly deny a marriage that the gods themselves had ordained? And how could he ignore the unprecedented connection he felt with a woman who had quite literally been delivered to him by the sacred river? These questions churned within him as he approached Aset's door, questions that would soon demand answers, for time was running short and the fate of 2 hearts and an entire kingdom hung in the balance. The cool pre-dawn air caressed Aset's skin as she moved silently through the small garden courtyard Ramses had granted her permission to visit. It was their compromise. She could not wander the palace freely, but this secluded space, protected by high walls and vigilant guards, offered a taste of freedom that had become increasingly precious to her as the days passed. She trailed her fingers over a lotus bloom floating in the small ornamental pond, watching ripples spread across the water's surface. Like memories, she thought, one touch, and the stillness is broken, patterns emerging that weren't visible before. 3 weeks had passed since Ramses had pulled her from the Nile, and while her body had fully recovered, her mind remained a labyrinth of shadows and fragments. Yet recently, something had changed. It began with the stars. That night when Nebamun had allowed her to view the night sky, and suddenly constellations had names again, their patterns familiar like the faces of old friends. Since then, other memories had begun to surface, disconnected pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite assemble. She remembered how to mix ink from specific minerals, how to calculate the movements of heavenly bodies, how to read not only modern hieroglyphs, but ancient variants that even Ramses' scholars found challenging. Yet personal details, her family, her home, her true name, remained frustratingly elusive. "You're awake early." The deep voice startled her, and she turned to find Ramses standing at the garden entrance, already dressed in his royal regalia, though the sun had barely begun to lighten the eastern horizon. In these early hours, without the formal audience of courtiers and servants, he seemed somehow more human, still regal but approachable in a way that both comforted and confused her. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. The dreams came again. Concern furrowed his brow as he moved to join her beside the pool. "The same ones," she nodded. "Corridors I've never walked yet somehow know. Voices chanting in a chamber filled with light. And always, the sensation of falling, of being pushed." She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. "The royal physician believes these may be fragments of memory returning," Ramses said gently. "Perhaps if you describe these corridors—" "They're here," she blurted out, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "In the palace." Ramses went very still. "You're certain?" "I believe so," she said, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Last night, when Meritaten was escorting me back from your library, we passed a particular column with a carving of Thoth, and I knew I had seen it before. Not recently, but—" She struggled to articulate the strange sensation. "It was as though I was seeing it through 2 sets of eyes simultaneously. One new, one from before." A charged silence fell between them. Both knew the implications of her words. If Aset had been in the palace before, it narrowed the possibilities of her identity considerably. She was either a high-born visitor who had been received at court, a temple priestess permitted in the sacred areas, or perhaps even a member of a royal or noble household. "There's something else," she continued, emboldened by his attentive silence. "Yesterday, while reading the scroll on temple ceremonies you provided, I found I could recite certain prayers before even reading them, as though the words were already within me." She met his gaze directly. "Prayers only taught to initiates of the highest order." Ramses's eyes widened slightly. "You believe you may have been a priestess?" "Perhaps." She turned away, gazing at the lightening sky. "Or was being trained as one. But that doesn't explain the other knowledge, the star charts, the mathematical calculations. Most temple initiates specialize in one divine domain, yet I seem to have knowledge across many." "A royal tutor, then," Ramses suggested. "Someone educated broadly to instruct others." Aset shook her head, frustration evident in her posture. "Nothing feels quite right." It's as though I'm looking at my own reflection in disturbed water. I recognize the general shape but cannot make out the details. Ramses was quiet for a moment, considering. There is one way we might be able to test your connection to the palace, he said finally. A part of the royal complex few are permitted to enter, the ancient corridors beneath the Temple of Hathor. If you truly have been here before in some capacity, those sacred spaces might trigger stronger memories. Hope flared within her. You would take me there. It is a risk, he admitted. Those corridors are restricted to the royal family and the highest priests. If someone were to see you, he left the implications hanging. I understand, she said quickly. But please, if there's any chance it might help me remember who I am. Tonight, he decided. After the evening rituals, when most of the court has retired, I will come for you myself. Relief and gratitude washed over her. Thank you, my lord. Ramses' expression softened and he reached out, his fingers lightly brushing a strand of hair from her face with unexpected tenderness. You need not call me my lord when we are alone, Aset. I have told you this. The intimacy of the gesture sent warmth spreading through her chest. These moments between them had been increasing, small touches, lingering gazes, conversations that stretched into the night hours. She knew she should maintain more distance from the man who was, after all, her benefactor and Egypt's divine ruler. Yet something about him called to her in ways she couldn't explain, as though they had known each other in some previous life. Ramses, then, she conceded, his name feeling both foreign and familiar on her tongue. He smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his usually stern features. I must attend the morning court, but I will return for you after nightfall. Be ready. He turned to leave, then paused. And Aset, tell no one of our plans, not even Nebamun or your handmaidens. She nodded her understanding, watching as he strode from the garden, once again every inch the pharaoh, rather than the man who had stood beside her moments ago. Only when he had disappeared from view did she release the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Aset attempted to occupy herself with the scrolls Ramses had provided, but found her thoughts constantly drifting to the night ahead. What would the ancient corridors reveal? Would she finally unlock the mystery of her identity? And if she did, what then? Would she still have a place in Ramses' household, or would duty require him to send her away? This last thought troubled her more than she cared to admit. By the time darkness fell, Aset had changed into the simple linen dress she'd been provided, forsaking the more elaborate gown and jewelry her handmaidens had suggested earlier. If they were to move through the palace unseen, better to attract as little attention as possible. As promised, Ramses came for her himself, arriving without announcement just as the palace bells signaled the midnight hour. He had also dressed simply, wearing a plain kilt and head covering rather than his royal regalia. Are you ready? He asked without preamble. She nodded, heart racing with anticipation and a touch of fear. Stay close, he instructed, producing a small oil lamp. The way is dark, and we must avoid the regular guard patrols. They moved through the palace like shadows, Ramses leading her down servants' passages and hidden corridors she hadn't known existed. Occasionally he would raise a hand, signaling for her to stop and press against a wall as guards passed nearby. The secrecy, the shared danger of their mission, created an unexpected intimacy between them. After what seemed like hours of winding through the labyrinthine palace, they reached a small, unassuming door, partially hidden behind a statue of the goddess Hathor. Ramses produced a key from within his robes, the metal glinting dully in the lamplight. Few know of this entrance, he explained quietly. It was built by my grandfather, allowing the royal family private access to the sacred spaces beneath the temple without the formal procession usually required. The lock turned with a soft click, and the door swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Ramses lifted the lamp higher, illuminating worn stone steps that spiraled downward. These corridors are ancient, older than the palace itself, he continued as they began their descent. They say they were constructed during the first dynasty, when the gods still walked among men. The air grew cooler and heavier with each step, carrying the scent of incense and old stone. Aset felt a strange tightness in her chest, not fear exactly, but a sense of anticipation that bordered on recognition. Does anything seem familiar? Ramses asked, watching her reactions closely. Not yet, she whispered, but there's something, a feeling. They reached the bottom of the staircase and emerged into a wide corridor lined with columns carved in the shape of lotus blossoms. Painted scenes adorned the walls between them, vivid depictions of gods and goddesses performing sacred rituals. "This is the corridor of preparations," Ramses explained, "where initiates would purify themselves before entering the inner sanctums." Aset moved as though in a trance, her fingers trailing lightly over the painted figures. "The blue pigment," she murmured. "It's made from crushed lapis lazuli mixed with the egg whites of ibis birds. Very rare, very sacred." Ramses looked at her sharply. "How did you know that?" "Even I was not aware of the specific preparation." She shook her head, confused. "I don't know. The words simply came to me." They continued deeper into the complex, passing through chambers dedicated to various deities. In each space, Aset found herself knowing small details: the correct way to light the ceremonial lamps, the proper offerings for each god, the meaning of obscure symbols carved into door lintels. "You've been trained in temple rituals," Ramses observed. "That much is becoming clear." "Yes, but—" She stopped abruptly as they entered a large circular chamber. Unlike the other rooms, which had been decorated with colorful paintings and hieroglyphs, this space was dominated by a domed ceiling painted deep blue and dotted with thousands of gold stars arranged in precise constellations. A gasp escaped her lips as she stared upward. "The chamber of the sky," she whispered, "where the movements of the heavens are recorded and interpreted." Ramses watched her intently. "You know this place." She moved to the center of the room, where a circular stone table stood. Its surface was carved with channels and depressions, forming an elaborate model of the celestial sphere. Without thinking, she reached out and adjusted several small markers that rested on the table's surface, moving them into new positions. "The alignment was wrong," she explained, though Ramses hadn't asked. "Sirius has moved 3 degrees since the last observation. And these," she pointed to another set of markers, "represent the wandering stars. They must be updated regularly to maintain accuracy. Only the royal astronomers and the highest priests of Thoth are permitted to touch the star table," Ramses said quietly. "Even I am not trained in its proper use." Aset's hands froze, and she looked down at what she had done with growing confusion. "I don't understand how I know this," she whispered, "but it feels as natural as breathing." Ramses moved closer, his face illuminated by the golden light reflecting from the star-painted ceiling. "There's more to this complex. Come." He led her through an archway into a smaller, rectangular chamber. Here, the walls were lined with niches, each containing papyrus scrolls stored in cedar boxes. "The hidden library," he said. "Texts too sacred or dangerous for the public archives. Knowledge preserved since the time of the first kings." Aset felt a powerful pull toward one particular section. Moving as though guided by an invisible hand, she approached a niche near the far corner and reached for a specific box without hesitation. Her fingers trembled as she lifted its lid, revealing a scroll bound with a red cord. "The Treatise on Divine Mathematics," she said, her voice barely audible. "Written during the reign of Khufu by the sage Imhotep." Ramses stepped forward in alarm. "How could you possibly know?" "Because I've read it before," she interrupted, certainty flooding through her. "Many times. I've studied every word." She carefully unrolled a portion of the papyrus, her eyes scanning the dense hieratic script. "See here, this passage describes the relationship between the movements of celestial bodies and the cycles of the Nile." And here, her finger traced a series of calculations, the formula for predicting the precise moment of sunrise on any given day of the year. "Aset," Ramses said slowly, "these texts are forbidden to all but the royal family and their most trusted advisors. If you have studied them—" She looked up at him, her eyes wide with the implications. "Then I must have been close to the royal household." Her heart pounded as more pieces fell into place. "The corridors in my dreams, they're here in this complex. I know the way from here to the Temple of Hathor without needing guidance. I know that beyond that door," she pointed to a sealed entrance on the western wall, "lies the Chamber of Rebirth, where royal children undergo their first sacred rituals." "This is extraordinary," Ramses murmured, "but it still doesn't explain how you came to be in the Nile or why your memory was taken from you." A sudden flash of memory struck Aset with such force that she staggered, nearly dropping the precious scroll. Ramses moved quickly to support her, his arms circling her waist. "What is it? What do you remember?" "Voices," she whispered, pressing a hand to her temple. "Arguing. Someone saying I knew too much, that I had to be removed." The fragmentary memory slipped away before she could grasp it fully, leaving only a lingering sense of danger. "I think," "I think someone tried to kill me." The gravity of her words hung in the air between them. If she was right, if someone had indeed attempted to murder her, then her presence in the palace might still put her at risk, especially if her would-be killer was someone within the court itself. "We should return," Ramses decided, carefully taking the scroll from her hands and replacing it in its box. "The night grows late, and we've learned much already." Aset nodded, though reluctance filled her. Being in these sacred spaces had awakened something within her, a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing since she'd opened her eyes on Ramses's barge. As they retraced their steps through the ancient corridors, Aset found herself navigating without guidance, instinctively knowing which turns to take and which passages to avoid. Ramses noted this with a mixture of fascination and concern. "Your connection to this place is undeniable," he observed as they ascended the spiral staircase that would return them to the main palace. "Tomorrow, I will have Nebamun discreetly investigate which scholars or priestesses might have gone missing in recent months. Perhaps someone has been searching for you." The thought sent an unexpected chill through her. "And if they have?" Ramses paused, turning to face her on the narrow staircase. In the dim lamplight, his features were cast in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. "Then we will need to determine whether they wish you well or ill," he said simply. "But know this, Aset." He reached out, his hand closing gently around hers. "Whatever we discover about your past, you have my protection. No harm will come to you while you are under my care." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. In that moment, standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, Aset felt a connection with Ramses that transcended the relationship between a king and his subject, a bond that seemed to exist outside the rigid hierarchies of the Egyptian court. "Thank you," she whispered, aware of how inadequate the words were to express her gratitude. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a moment of vulnerability rarely permitted to one who must embody divine strength at all times. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might say more, might give voice to the unspoken tension that had been building between them since the day he'd pulled her from the river. Instead, he gently released her hand and continued up the stairs. "Dawn approaches. We must return you to your chambers before the palace awakens." The spell broken, Aset followed him silently, her mind racing with all they had discovered and all that remained unknown. She was someone who had walked these sacred corridors before, someone with knowledge that few in Egypt possessed. But who exactly? And why had someone wanted her silenced? As they reached her chambers and Ramses bid her a formal goodnight, one last memory surfaced, fleeting but distinct. A face reflected in polished bronze, wearing a headdress reserved for royal tutors. Her own face. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, heart pounding. Was that truly who she had been? An instructor to royal children? It would explain her knowledge, her access to sacred texts, her familiarity with the palace. But as she moved to her window and gazed out at the stars, another question troubled her even more deeply. If she did recover her full identity, if she reclaimed her place in Egyptian society, what would it mean for the connection that had formed between herself and Ramses? A connection that, despite all propriety and protocol, she could no longer deny, was turning into something far more complicated than gratitude. And somewhere in the palace, unbeknownst to either of them, Princess Nefret lay awake, planning her own moves in the dangerous game of court politics, a game in which an unexplained woman in the pharaoh's household represented both a mystery and a threat to her carefully constructed future. Princess Nefret stood motionless before the polished bronze mirror, her eyes narrowed as a handmaiden applied the final touches of kohl to her lids. Outside her chambers, the palace hummed with activity as the court prepared for the upcoming festival, the celebration that would culminate in her marriage to Pharaoh Ramses. Yet despite the flurry of preparations being made in her honor, Nefret's thoughts were focused elsewhere. "That's enough," she said abruptly, waving away the servant. "Leave me, all of you." The handmaidens exchanged worried glances. The princess was known for her mercurial moods, but quickly bowed and retreated from the chamber. Only when the cedar door closed behind the last of them did Nefret allow her carefully maintained composure to slip, her painted lips curling into a scowl. "You can come out now," she called toward a heavy curtain that concealed a small alcove. The fabric rustled, and a slender figure emerged. Hori, her personal scribe, a man whose unremarkable appearance belied his exceptional talents for gathering information that was not meant to be heard. "Well?" Nefret demanded, not bothering to turn from her reflection. "What have you discovered?" Hori bowed low, though the gesture went unseen. "The rumors persist, my princess. Pharaoh has indeed been keeping a woman in the royal family's private wing. A concubine." Nefret's voice was sharp, though this news would hardly be surprising. Pharaohs often kept numerous women in their households. "No, my princess." Hori's voice dropped lower. "The servants say she is treated with unusual respect. She dines on fine foods, is given access to the royal library, and the pharaoh himself visits her chambers regularly, often staying until the late hours, engaged in conversation." Conversation? Nefret turned now, skepticism evident in her arched brow. "So they claim. She is apparently educated, reads and writes hieroglyphs with great proficiency." Nefret tapped her long painted nails against the cedar dressing table. "Who is she? Where did she come from?" "That remains unclear, my princess. The servants know only that she appeared suddenly about 3 weeks ago. She is called Aset, though there are whispers that this is not her true name." 3 weeks, Nefret mused. "Around the time Ramses was returning from that inspection of the northern floodplains, before my arrival." Her eyes narrowed further. "What does she look like, this mysterious Aset?" "Young, perhaps 20 summers, unusual in appearance, with eyes the color of green faience, dark hair, olive skin, beautiful, they say, though in an uncommon way." Hori hesitated. "There is something else, my princess, something strange." "Speak." "The woman reportedly has no memory of her past. She was found half drowned in the Nile during a storm. Pharaoh himself pulled her from the water. This detail caused Nefret to go very still. The Nile delivered her to him. The implications were clear. Such an event could easily be interpreted as a divine sign, especially by a populace prone to seeing the god's hands in every unusual occurrence." "So the story goes," Hori confirmed. "And since then, Pharaoh has kept her presence largely secret, especially from the priests of Amun." Nefret began to pace, her mind working rapidly. For years she had been groomed for her role as great royal wife of Egypt. Her father, the ambitious governor of Memphis, had negotiated the marriage contract when she was barely old enough to understand its significance. Since then, every lesson, every skill she had acquired had been in service to this singular goal, to become Queen of Egypt, and through her, to increase her family's influence at court. Now, a month before her carefully orchestrated ascension, an unknown woman had appeared in Ramses' life, a woman who occupied his thoughts, commanded his personal attention, and worst of all, had arrived in a manner that could be interpreted as divinely orchestrated. "This will not do," she murmured. "Not at all." "What would you have me do, my princess?" Hori asked, his tone neutral, though he well understood the danger inherent in his mistress's schemes. Nefret paused before her cosmetics table, lifting a small alabaster jar and removing its stopper. The scent of blue lotus filled the air, her signature perfume, exotic and intoxicating. "First, we need more information," she decided, dabbing the fragrant oil at her wrists and throat. "I want to know everything about this woman, where exactly she was found, what she does with her days, what she and Ramses discussed during their lengthy conversations." Her lips curved in a cold smile. "Knowledge is power, dear Hori. Before I can neutralize this threat, I must understand it fully." "It shall be done, my princess." Nefret replaced the stopper in the perfume jar with deliberate care. "And arrange for me to have a chance encounter with the High Priest of Amun. I believe it's time I expressed my deep interest in the proper religious preparations for the royal wedding." Hori's eyes widened slightly as he grasped her intent. "The priests are already troubled by rumors of the woman's presence." "Precisely." Nefret's smile widened. "And they wield considerable influence, even over Pharaoh himself. If they came to believe that this woman represented some threat to proper ritual order." "A dangerous game, my princess," Hori warned. "If Pharaoh discovers your involvement—" "He won't," she cut him off sharply. "That's why I have you, dear Hori. Your talents for discretion are why my father assigned you to my household." She turned to face him fully, her expression hardening. "Speaking of my father, send word to him. Coded, of course. Tell him there may be complications in the arrangements. Nothing specific, just enough to ensure he remains alert to the possibility that we may need his intervention." Hori bowed again. "As you command, my princess. Go now. I have prayers to offer at the Temple of Hathor, a future bride's devotions." Her tone made it clear that prayer was the least of her concerns. Once alone, Nefret returned to the bronze mirror, studying her reflection with calculating eyes. Beauty had always been her weapon, that and the sharp intelligence she carefully concealed behind a mask of demure femininity. Men, she had learned early, expected little from a beautiful woman except to be beautiful. It made them careless, made them reveal things they shouldn't. Even Ramses, for all his vaunted wisdom, was not immune. During their formal meeting since her arrival, she had played her part perfectly, the respectful, eager bride-to-be, suitably impressed by his divine majesty, while offering just enough spirited conversation to intrigue without threatening. He had been polite, attentive even, but distant in a way she hadn't anticipated. Now she understood why. His thoughts had been elsewhere, with this mysterious woman who had emerged from the sacred river like some living embodiment of a divine omen. "We'll see about that," Nefret murmured to her reflection. "Egypt will have its queen, and it will be me." The Temple of Hathor bustled with activity as priests and priestesses prepared for the upcoming festival. Incense filled the air with sweet smoke, while acolytes polished bronze altarpieces until they gleamed in the lamplight. Into this scene of ordered devotion came Princess Nefret, accompanied by her handmaidens, her arrival causing a ripple of bows and murmured greetings. "Princess," the high priestess of Hathor greeted her, touching her forehead in respect. "We are honored by your presence. Have you come to offer prayers for your upcoming union?" "Indeed, revered one," Nefret replied, her voice modulated to convey appropriate piety. "As the blessed day approaches, I seek the goddess's favor in all matters of love and harmony. A worthy pursuit for any bride, but especially for one who will be great royal wife." The priestess gestured toward the inner sanctuary. "Come, the goddess awaits your devotions." As they moved deeper into the temple, Nefret allowed her gaze to wander, noting with satisfaction the presence of a particular figure near one of the side altars. Amenemhat, high priest of Amun, his leopard skin cloak marking his exalted status. Their eyes met briefly, and Nefret offered a respectful nod before continuing on her way. The message had been received. Later, after completing her public devotions, Nefret lingered in the temple gardens, ostensibly to admire the lotus pools, but in reality waiting for the encounter she had arranged. She didn't wait long. "Princess Nefret," came a sonorous voice from behind her. "May Hathor bless you with joy and fertility in your upcoming union." She turned, offering a deep bow to Amenemhat. "High priest, you honor me with your blessing. It is my sacred duty to ensure that Pharaoh's marriage strengthens both his house and the divine order of Egypt." He joined her beside the lotus pool, his weathered hands clasped before him. "Are the preparations proceeding to your satisfaction?" "They are magnificent," she assured him, though she let her voice trail off, allowing a carefully calculated crease of worry to appear between her brows. "You seem troubled, princess." On the threshold of such joy, what could cause you concern? Nefret glanced around as though ensuring they were not overheard, then leaned slightly closer. "It is not my place to question the ways of the palace, especially as I am newly arrived, but I have heard whispers." The high priest's expression remained impassive, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "Whispers? About a foreign woman kept within the royal family's wing, one who arrived under unusual circumstances." Nefret allowed her voice to drop even lower. "I would never presume to question Pharaoh's wisdom, but as his future wife, I cannot help but wonder if this woman's presence might somehow disrupt the harmony necessary for a blessed union." Amenemhat's lips thinned almost imperceptibly. "These rumors have reached the temple as well, princess, though Pharaoh has not seen fit to explain the woman's presence to the priesthood." "How troubling," Nefret murmured, her tone suggesting she found it not merely troubling but potentially sacrilegious, especially with the festival of Opet approaching, such an auspicious time when the divine and earthly realms are so closely aligned. Any irregularity in ritual preparation could have consequences. The high priest studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the politics of the situation. Nefret maintained her expression of innocent concern, though inwardly she smiled at how easily the seeds of doubt could be planted. "Your devotion to proper ritual order does you credit, princess," he said finally. "Rest assured that the priesthood of Amun takes its responsibilities to maintain Ma'at very seriously. If there is any threat to the divine harmony, it will be addressed." "I am comforted to hear it," Nefret replied, bowing her head demurely. "I seek only to be a worthy vessel for the continuation of Pharaoh's divine line. Anything that might jeopardize that sacred duty concerns me deeply." "As it should," Amenemhat nodded approvingly. Perhaps it would be beneficial if this woman were formally presented to the court before the festival, to dispel rumors and ensure that her presence is properly sanctioned by the proper religious authorities. Exactly as she had hoped. Nefret allowed a look of relief to wash over her features. What wisdom you possess, High Priest. Surely such a public clarification would put all concerns to rest. I will suggest as much to Pharaoh during tomorrow's ritual council, Amenemhat decided. It is only proper that any guest in the royal household be formally acknowledged before such an important religious festival. The gods surely speak through you, Nefret said, bowing again. As she departed the temple shortly thereafter, satisfaction warmed her veins like fine wine. If this mysterious asset was indeed as foreign and unusual as rumored, a formal presentation to the Egyptian court, with its rigid protocols and traditions, would either expose her unsuitability or force Ramses to publicly acknowledge her status. Either outcome would serve Nefret's purposes. If the woman fumbled court etiquette or showed ignorance of proper protocols, she would appear uncultured and inappropriate as a royal companion. And if Ramses was forced to officially explain her presence, he would have to define her role, concubine, servant, or guest, establishing clear boundaries that would prevent any elevation of her status once Nefret became queen. It was a perfect trap, and the priests of Amun, always eager to assert their influence over palace matters, had taken the bait willingly. Deep within the palace, Ramses frowned as he read the formal request that had been delivered from the temple of Amun. Beside him, Vizier Pasa shifted uncomfortably, well aware of his master's displeasure. They overstep, Ramses said finally, setting the papyrus down with barely controlled anger. The management of my household is not the concern of the priesthood. The request is unusually direct, Divine One, Pasa acknowledged cautiously. However, with the Opet festival approaching and your marriage ceremony to follow, perhaps addressing these rumors directly might be politically expedient. Ramses shot him a sharp look. You think I should parade Aset before the court like some curiosity? Subject her to their scrutiny and gossip? Not as a curiosity, my pharaoh, Pasa clarified hastily, but as an honored guest whose presence has been blessed by your divine favor. It would silence the whispers while allowing you to control the narrative. The vizier's reasoning was sound, much as Ramses was loath to admit it. The rumors surrounding Aset had grown rather than diminished, despite his efforts at discretion. Servants talked, guards gossiped, and within the closed ecosystem of palace life, secrets rarely remained secret for long. And what role would you have me assign her? Ramses asked, rising to pace the length of his private audience chamber. She herself does not yet know who she is. How can I present her to the court? Perhaps as a scholar or astronomer, rescued from misfortune and granted your protection, Pasa suggested. Her knowledge of the stars has already proven valuable to the temple astronomers. It would be a legitimate explanation for her presence. Ramses considered this. In the weeks since Aset's arrival, she had indeed begun working with the royal astronomers, helping to correct and refine their celestial charts based on her extraordinary knowledge. It was a role that suited her evident expertise, while they continued to search for clues to her true identity. Yet something about the timing of this request troubled him. The priests have known of her presence for weeks. Why press the issue now, just days before Princess Nefret's pre-wedding celebrations begin? Pasa hesitated, choosing his words with care. There are some who suggest that the princess herself may have expressed concerns about the presence of an unknown woman in the royal household. Ramses stopped pacing. Nefret, he said flatly. She sees Aset as a threat to her position. It would be natural for a bride to question the presence of another woman in her future home, Pasa offered diplomatically, especially one who appears to enjoy the pharaoh's particular favor. Politics, Ramses muttered disgustedly. Always politics. Yet he knew he could not simply dismiss the request. The priests of Amun held significant influence, and with the important festival approaching, antagonizing them would be unwise. Moreover, if Nefret was indeed behind this maneuver, it revealed a political acumen that he would need to address directly. Very well, he decided reluctantly. Arrange for Aset to be formally presented during the opening banquet of the festival. But Pasa, his voice took on a warning edge, she is to be treated with every courtesy. Make it clear that she enjoys my personal protection. Of course, Divine One. Pasa bowed deeply. Shall I inform the lady herself of this decision? Ramses shook his head. No, I will tell her. It was a conversation he did not relish, knowing how Aset valued her privacy as she struggled to reclaim her identity. But better she hear it from him. than be surprised by the arrangements. After the vizier had departed, Ramses remained lost in thought. The political maneuvering was tiresome, but expected. What troubled him more was his own reaction to it, the fierce protectiveness he felt toward Aset, a feeling that went beyond his duty as her rescuer and benefactor. In the weeks since pulling her from the Nile, she had become important to him. Their conversations challenged and stimulated his mind in ways court discourse never did. Her perspective, somehow both familiar with Egyptian customs yet slightly apart from them, offered insights he found increasingly valuable. And her presence brought a lightness to his spirit that had been absent for too long. These feelings were dangerous, he knew. As pharaoh, his marriages were matters of state, not heart. His upcoming union with Nefret had been arranged to strengthen Egypt's internal stability, particularly with the northern provinces, where her father's influence was strong. Personal sentiment had no place in such calculations. Yet as he prepared to visit Aset's chambers to deliver news he knew would distress her, Ramses could not deny that this mysterious woman had awakened something within him that he had long thought dormant, a yearning for connection beyond the formal deference that surrounded him as Egypt's living god. And somewhere in the palace, Princess Nefret smiled as her handmaiden delivered news that her strategy had borne fruit. The mysterious woman would indeed be presented at the festival banquet, where all could see her and judge whether she posed a true threat to the future queen's ambitions. The game was unfolding exactly as she had planned. For what better way to neutralize an opponent than to force them into the open, unprepared and vulnerable, before the critical eyes of Egypt's most powerful nobles and priests? Little did Nefret know that in Aset's chambers, fragments of memory were continuing to surface, pieces of a past that, once fully assembled, would shake the very foundations of the royal court and threaten not just Nefret's ambitious plans, but the carefully constructed narrative of one of Egypt's most powerful families. The Great Hall of Thebes blazed with light from 1,000 oil lamps as Egypt's elite gathered for the Opet festival. In an antechamber, Aset stood adorned in fine linen and royal jewelry, gifts from Ramses himself that marked his favor. As she entered the hall, a strange confidence overcame her. Approaching the throne where Ramses sat resplendent and Princess Nefret watched with thinly veiled hostility, Aset performed the required bows perfectly. But then, without thinking, her hands formed the sacred greeting used exclusively by royal tutors. Gasps echoed through the hall. High Priest Amenemhat demanded to know how she possessed such knowledge. Before she could answer, an elderly man stepped forward. Master Ipua, Egypt's most renowned astronomer. "This is Mernith, my most brilliant student," he declared, explaining she had served as tutor to noble children, including Princess Nefret's siblings. The name unlocked a flood of memories. Mernith. She remembered serving in the household of Memphis's governor, discovering documents revealing his theft from royal granaries, and being thrown into the Nile to silence her. As she shared these revelations, Governor A himself arrived, denying everything. But when Nefret's handmaiden was caught trying to remove incriminating documents, the truth became undeniable. "You will remain in Thebes until this is resolved," Ramses commanded the governor, while turning to Mernith with newfound respect. In one evening, she had reclaimed her identity and become central to a political storm that would change the course of Egypt itself. The investigation of Governor A continued into the night, but the festival demanded its ceremonies proceed. As dawn broke, the court reconvened for the day's rituals. Mernith stood among the nobles, her new identity acknowledged but her position uncertain. Whispers surrounded her, some supportive, others suspicious. The corruption she'd exposed had powerful backers. Suddenly, trumpets blared. The high priest of Amun stepped forward, raising his arms for silence. "Hear the divine proclamation. In 14 days, at the culmination of Opet, our divine pharaoh shall join in sacred union with Princess Nefret of Memphis, binding the two lands in harmony." The announcement struck Mernith like a physical blow. Despite everything, the attempted murder, the corruption, the marriage would proceed. Her eyes found Ramses on his throne, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Princess Nefret smiled triumphantly, her gaze briefly meeting Mernith's with undisguised satisfaction. Mernith maintained her composure, though her heart crumbled. Political necessity, she understood. Governor A might face justice, but breaking the marriage alliance could destabilize the kingdom. As the crowd cheered, only Mernith noticed Ramses's white-knuckled grip on his throne, and the brief moment when his eyes sought hers, filled with unspoken regret. Unable to sleep after the marriage announcement, Mernith sought refuge in the temple library. Ancient knowledge had always comforted her, and tonight she needed that solace desperately. The scrolls blurred before her eyes until one caught her attention, a genealogy of noble houses dating back 5 dynasties. A familiar symbol on its seal triggered another memory fragment. Working feverishly through the night, she traced bloodlines across multiple documents, her astronomer's precision applied to human connections rather than stars. Dawn found her surrounded by unfurled papyri, her face pale with shock at what she'd discovered. "I knew you would find it eventually," came Master Ipua's voice from the doorway. "Your heritage was hidden for protection, not shame." The truth was undeniable. The family that had fallen from grace 20 years ago, eliminated for supposed treason, was her own. Her parents, minor royalty with legitimate claims to the throne, had been systematically destroyed by Governor A's father in his rise to power. The evidence was all there in the temple records, deliberate erasure poorly executed, connections preserved in overlooked documents. Mernith wasn't merely a tutor who had uncovered corruption. She was the last survivor of a noble bloodline, one with claims that threatened Nefret's family directly. Clutching the genealogy scrolls, Mernith strode purposefully through the palace corridors. Guards, now familiar with her, stepped aside without question. She found Princess Nefret in the royal gardens, directing servants in festival preparations. When their eyes met, the princess dismissed her attendants with a flick of her wrist. "I wondered when you would discover it," Nefret said coolly. "You always were cleverer than most." "Your family destroyed mine," Mernith replied, voice steady despite her racing heart. "Not for treason, but to eliminate legitimate heirs who stood in your father's path." Nefret laughed without humor. "Politics, my dear, nothing personal. Your parents were inconvenient, and now I am similarly inconvenient?" "Precisely, though it seems the Nile refused our offering." Nefret stepped closer. "Ramses may be intrigued by you now, but the marriage proceeds in 13 days. Once I am queen, you'll be sent to a distant temple, if you're fortunate. The pharaoh knows of your family's corruption, yet the alliance stands," Nefret countered. "Egypt needs Memphis's loyalty more than it needs justice for one forgotten family." As Mernith turned to leave, Nefret called after her, "We always win in the end. Remember that." Ramses sat alone in his private chamber, the weight of the double crown absent, but its burden still heavy on his spirit. The evidence against Governor A was damning, yet the political alliance remained necessary. The northern provinces would rebel without Memphis's support. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Without waiting for permission, Mernith entered, her face resolute as she placed the genealogy scrolls before him. "You should have told me," he said softly. "I only just discovered it myself." He studied her with new understanding. The noble bearing that had seemed mysterious now made perfect sense. It was birthright, not training. "The council advises proceeding with the marriage despite everything," Ramses confessed. "State before sentiment, always." "And what does the man behind the crown want?" she asked. Their eyes met, a moment of raw honesty between them. "Something impossible," he whispered. Rising suddenly, Ramses summoned his guard captain. "Bring the high priests, now." When the religious leaders assembled, Ramses' declaration stunned them all. "I reject this compromised engagement. I cannot bind Egypt to corruption, no matter the political cost." As protests erupted, he continued, "I stand for truth and justice, the foundations of Ma'at. Without these, we are nothing." Looking at Mernith, he added words that would change Egypt forever. "And I love her." The palace erupted into chaos following Ramses' declaration. Messengers raced to Memphis, while priests huddled in urgent consultation. Nobles chose sides, some backing tradition, others the living god's decision. "You've started a war," Mernith whispered as they strategized in the map room, surrounded by Ramses' most loyal advisors. "Truth is always worth fighting for," he replied, marking garrison positions on a papyrus map. "Memphis will mobilize its forces within days. We must be prepared." Reports arrived hourly. Governor A had fled house arrest. Princess Nefret had barricaded herself with loyalists. 3 northern provinces had declared independence. Ramses dispatched trusted commanders to secure key strongholds, while Mernith worked with Master Ipua to release evidence of corruption to every temple in Egypt. "The people must understand what we fight for," she insisted. "Not love between a pharaoh and a woman, but restoration of Ma'at, of justice and truth." Scribes copied the evidence tirelessly. Couriers departed under cover of darkness. While Memphis mustered an army, Ramses and Mernith mustered something potentially stronger: moral authority. That night, holding hands beneath stars they both had studied, they made their covenant to restore honor to Egypt, or fall together trying. Whatever comes, Ramses vowed, we face it as one. 7 days of tense preparation passed before the confrontation arrived, not on a battlefield as expected, but in the temple of Amun during a rare solar eclipse, a celestial event Mernith had predicted years earlier. As darkness fell unnaturally at midday, Ramses stood before the assembled priests and nobles. Governor A and his supporters had demanded this audience, believing the temple's sacred ground would force compromise. The gods themselves darkened the sun in judgment, the high priest intoned nervously, as confusion spread among those gathered. Not in judgment, but in witness, Mernith corrected, her astronomer's knowledge lending authority to her words. They create this moment for truth to be spoken in perfect balance between light and darkness. Ramses seized the opportunity. When the solar disk began to emerge once more, he delivered his judgment. Corruption would be punished, regardless of rank. Governor A was stripped of position and property. His co-conspirators faced similar fates, yet Ramses also offered mercy: no executions, no erasure from history. Those implicated could retain basic dignity in distant exile. I stand for Ma'at, Ramses declared as full light returned. Justice tempered by compassion is my judgment as Egypt's living Horus. The priests, seeing celestial approval in the timing, bowed in acceptance. Even A's supporters couldn't deny the divine significance. Against all expectations, the showdown ended not with bloodshed, but with restoration of sacred order. In the Hall of Records, royal scribes worked methodically under Mernith's guidance. 20 years of deliberate omissions and falsified history were being corrected, her family's legacy restored line by careful line. Senechtenre and Tetisheri of the House of Intef, she read aloud, tracing her parents' names as they were properly inscribed in the royal annals. Loyal servants of Egypt unjustly accused. The chief scribe nodded respectfully. With these records corrected, your lineage stands officially restored, my lady. Outside, stonemasons chiseled her family cartouche back onto monuments from which they'd been erased. Temple painters restored figures that had been covered with plaster. Material restoration accompanied the historical one. Ramses entered quietly, watching Mernith direct this reclamation of truth. When their eyes met, his were filled with admiration. How does it feel, he asked, to reclaim your name after all this time? Like finally being able to breathe, she replied, emotion tightening her throat. Not just for me, but for them. They exist again. Later at the Temple of Hathor, Mernith made offerings to her ancestors, now officially honored once more. As incense spiraled toward the heavens, she felt a sense of completion. A circle closed, a wrong finally righted. Her parents could rest peacefully at last, their daughter having restored what was wrongfully taken. Princess Nefret stood before the royal court, her regal bearing intact despite her dramatically altered circumstances. Gone were her elaborate jewels and fine cosmetics. She wore simple linen, her only adornment a plain bronze ankh, symbol of life granted by Pharaoh's mercy. You understand the terms of your exile? Ramses asked from his throne, his tone formal but not cruel. I do, she replied, chin lifted defiantly. The Eastern Oasis, no communication with Memphis, no involvement in politics. Mernith watched from beside the throne, feeling neither joy nor vindication at her rival's downfall, only a solemn recognition of justice being served. When permitted her final words before departure, Nefret turned unexpectedly toward Mernith. You think you've won, she said quietly. Perhaps you have, for now. But remember this, dynasties rise and fall. I am patient. I will return. The threat hung in the air, undisguised and unrepentant. As guards escorted Nefret from the hall, Mernith contemplated how ambition, once corrupted, rarely died completely. The princess would indeed scheme from exile, but stripped of power and connections, her threats were merely empty words. She never understood, Ramses murmured beside her. True power comes from serving Ma'at, not oneself. With Nefret's departure, the final piece of the old order was swept away, clearing the path for Egypt's new beginning. The markets of Thebes buzzed with excitement as common folk discussed the extraordinary events that had transformed the royal court. Storytellers recounted the tale of Mernith, The forgotten noble who survived assassination returned without memory and ultimately restored justice to Egypt. "She was delivered by the Nile itself," declared one merchant, gesturing dramatically. "The gods preserved her for a purpose." What began as palace intrigue had captured the public imagination. Songs were composed about the astronomer who charted not just stars, but her own destiny. Children play-acted her dramatic revelation at the royal banquet. Initially skeptical nobles gradually accepted her legitimacy as evidence of her family's unjust treatment became irrefutable. Even conservative priests acknowledged the divine hand in her survival and return. When Mernith first appeared at the Temple of Hathor for public ceremonies, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers. Many prostrated themselves, seeing in her a symbol of Mahat's restoration, of balance and justice returning to Egypt. "They've embraced you completely," Ramses observed, watching the people's reaction. "They embrace what I represent," she corrected. "Hope for a more just Egypt, where truth prevails over power." As the kingdom stabilized under their joint guidance, people began to see in Mernith not just Ramses's chosen companion, but a leader in her own right, a queen worthy of the title not through birth or alliance, but through wisdom and courage. The sacred bark of Amun-Ra glided silently across the temple lake, lanterns reflecting like earthbound stars upon the still water. Ramses stood at the prow, resplendent in ceremonial regalia, while Mernith waited on the temple shore as tradition required. Tonight marked the culmination of the Opet festival, when the god Amun traveled from his sanctuary to commune with the mortal world. The date once intended for Ramses' wedding to Nefret had arrived, reimagined for a different purpose. When the bark touched shore, Ramses disembarked and approached Mernith. In his hands rested a lotus crown interwoven with blue faience beads that matched her eyes. "Mernith of the House of Intef," he spoke, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "The gods brought you back from the waters of death. They placed you in my path when I thought my course was fixed. They restored your memory and your lineage when all seemed lost." He held the crown before her, its craftsmanship reflecting thousands of years of Egyptian tradition. "I ask you not from political necessity, but from the depth of my heart. Become my wife, my queen, my partner in restoring Ma'at to our beloved Egypt." Mernith's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she accepted his offering. "Not for power or position," she answered, "but for love and purpose I accept." As Ramses placed the crown upon her head, the assembled priests and nobles erupted in approval, for this was a union blessed not by political machination, but by divine intervention and genuine affection. The temple of Amun-Ra had never witnessed such splendor. Gold leaf gleamed on every surface, catching the light of 1,000 lamps. Incense perfumed the air, while lotus blossoms and papyrus arrangements created a pathway between worlds. The mortal and divine united for this sacred occasion. Mernith stood at the temple entrance, adorned in a gown of finest linen so sheer it seemed woven from moonlight. A broad collar of gold, turquoise, and lapis lazuli encircled her throat, while a crown of similar materials rested upon her carefully arranged hair. In her hands, she carried blue lotus flowers, symbols of rebirth and transformation. When the temple drums began their rhythmic heartbeat, she moved forward with measured steps. Each movement was precisely choreographed according to traditions older than the pyramids themselves. Inside the inner sanctuary, Ramses awaited, magnificent in his ceremonial regalia, the double crown of unified Egypt upon his head. Their eyes met across the sacred space, communicating what words could not. How extraordinary their journey had been, from a storm-tossed river to this moment of divine blessing. The high priest conducted the ancient rites, binding their hands with a cloth of gold. Sacred oils anointed their brows. Prayers older than memory were chanted in perfect rhythm. "Two souls joined by the god's design," the priest declared. "Witness, all of Egypt, your pharaoh and his great royal wife." As they emerged from the temple into brilliant sunlight, the gathered crowds erupted in jubilation. What had begun with Mernith's mysterious arrival had culminated in a union that seemed written in the stars, a love story Egypt would remember for generations to come. The royal couple stood atop the palace balcony, silhouetted against the crimson and gold tapestry of the setting sun. Below them, Thebes stretched in magnificent splendor, white limestone buildings gleaming, temple obelisks reaching skyward, and the sacred Nile winding like a blue serpent through the heart of their kingdom. "1 year ago today you pulled me from the Nile," Mernith said softly. her hand finding Ramses as they watched the horizon transform. I opened my eyes without a past, without even a name, just darkness behind me and uncertainty ahead. "And now look at you," he replied, admiration warming his voice. "Great royal wife, astronomer of the two lands, beloved of the people. The gods had grand designs when they sent you to me." Mernith smiled, remembering the journey, from confusion to clarity, from vulnerability to strength. "The river that nearly claimed my life ultimately delivered me to my destiny." A comfortable silence enveloped them as they contemplated all that had transpired since that fateful storm. Corruption had been exposed, justice restored, a dynasty renewed on stronger foundations of truth and wisdom rather than power alone. In the distance, Master Ipua supervised construction of a new observatory, its design based on Mernith's celestial calculations. Scribes recorded her astronomical methods for future generations, preserving knowledge that would guide Egypt's agriculture and religious ceremonies for centuries to come. The northern provinces had stabilized under fair governance. Even Memphis flourished again, cleansed of corruption and led by officials chosen for integrity rather than loyalty to powerful families. Trade routes expanded, granaries filled, and the people prospered under leadership that honored Mahat in practice, not merely in rhetoric. "Sometimes I wonder," Ramses mused, "if I had not been inspecting the northern floodplains that day, if the storm had not forced our barge to that particular bend in the river. The stars ordained it," Mernith replied with gentle certainty. "My astronomical charts from before everything. They predicted that precise alignment of heavenly bodies on the day you found me. Perhaps some things truly are written in the stars." Ramses drew her closer, the heavy gold of his ceremonial collar meeting hers with a soft clink. "Our story is just beginning," he murmured into her hair. "Yet already woven into eternity," she responded, her astronomer's eye finding familiar constellations appearing one by one in the darkening sky, patterns she had studied all her life, now seeming to tell her own story back to her. As night embraced Egypt, temple lamps created a river of light mirroring the star-strewn heavens above. Two souls brought together by divine intervention, united by love and purpose, their legacy already extending far beyond themselves, into the eternal fabric of Egypt's grand tapestry. Together they had defeated those who would corrupt Ma'at, and together they would ensure that justice, wisdom, and compassion guided their kingdom into a golden age that history would remember for millennia to come. Their love story preserved in hieroglyphs and temple paintings, a testament to the power of truth and the enduring strength of hearts that find each other against all odds. Wasn't that a beautiful journey through ancient Egypt? The story of Ramses and Mernith reminds us that sometimes fate has different plans than the ones we carefully arrange. Their love story teaches us that truth and justice can triumph even when all seems lost. Did you find yourself holding your breath when Mernith was presented to the court? Or perhaps your heart raced when Ramses finally declared his love despite all political consequences? These moments of courage remind us that sometimes we must stand for what's right, even when it's difficult. I'd love to hear which part of the story touched you most deeply. Was it Mernith's struggle to reclaim her identity, Ramses' difficult choice between duty and love, or perhaps Nefret's dramatic downfall? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this ancient Egyptian romance stirred your soul, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next historical adventure. And if you haven't seen our previous video on star-crossed lovers in medieval Japan, be sure to watch it next for another emotional journey that will leave you breathless. Until next time, remember that the most powerful stories are written not in the stars, but in the human heart.